Imagine discovering a photograph so hauntingly beautiful that it becomes the centerpiece of every room it enters. A portrait so perfectly composed that viewers stand transfixed, drawn into the subject's serene expression and ethereal presence. For 3 years, such an image graced the homes and hearts of New England's finest families, bringing comfort to the grieving and peace to the troubled. But what happens when perfection hides a secret so disturbing that knowing the truth transforms beauty into nightmare? This is the story of how a single moment of honesty shattered the illusion of the most beloved photograph in Massachusetts, revealing that sometimes the most peaceful images are born from the most horrifying circumstances. The year was 1893, and in the coastal town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, photography had evolved beyond mere documentation into high art. The Victorian era's fascination with capturing the human spirit on film had reached its zenith, and nowhere was this more evident than in the studio of Edmund Thorne, the region's most celebrated portrait photographer. Thorne's reputation had been built on his uncanny ability to capture what he called the essential nature of his subjects. His portraits didn't merely show how people looked. They revealed who they were. Stern businessmen appeared vulnerable beneath their confident facades. Shy young women radiated hidden strength. Children seemed to hold ancient wisdom in their eyes. It was this gift that made Thorne's work so sought after by New England's social elite. His studio occupied the entire upper floor of a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its massive windows designed to capture the perfect northern light that gave his photographs their distinctive luminous quality. The walls displayed his finest works, dozens of portraits that seemed to breathe with life, each one a masterpiece of composition and emotional depth. But among all these celebrated images, one photograph held a position of special reverence above Thorne's mahogany desk. The portrait showed a young woman of perhaps 22 years, possessed of a beauty that transcended mere physical attractiveness. Her dark hair was arranged in the Gibson girl style fashionable at the time, swept up to reveal an elegant neck adorned with a simple strand of pearls. She wore a white dress of exquisite craftsmanship, its intricate lacework catching the light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. But it was her expression that made the portrait truly extraordinary. The young woman's face radiated a peace so profound it seemed to emanate from the photograph itself. Her eyes were gently downcast, not in sadness or submission, but in a kind of serene contemplation that suggested she had found answers to life's greatest mysteries. A subtle smile played at the corners of her mouth, as if she were privy to some wonderful secret. Her hands were folded in her lap with perfect grace, completing a composition that spoke of absolute tranquility. What made this image so remarkable was not just its technical perfection, but the profound emotional response it evoked in viewers. From the moment Thorne first displayed it in his studio in late 1893, visitors were invariably drawn to the portrait. They would stand before it for long minutes, studying the young woman's face with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "She looks like an angel," Mrs. Adelaide Spencer remarked during her first visit to commission a family portrait. "There's something almost divine about her expression. It's as if she's seeing something beautiful that the rest of us cannot perceive." Dr. James Morrison, a rational man of science who prided himself on his logical approach to life, found himself equally moved by the image. "I've never seen a photograph that conveyed such inner peace," he told Thorne. "Looking at her face, one almost believes that true serenity is possible in this troubled world." Word of the extraordinary portrait spread quickly through Millbrook's close-knit society. Soon, people were visiting Thorne's studio not to commission their own photographs, but simply to see the image that had captivated the entire town. They came in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, as if they were entering a sacred space. Many brought friends and family members, eager to share the profound sense of calm the portrait provided. The young woman's identity became a source of gentle speculation among the townspeople. Surely someone so beautiful, so perfectly at peace, must be known to someone in their small community. But when questioned, Thorne would only smile mysteriously and refer to the portrait as a private commission or a family matter too delicate to discuss. This air of mystery only added to the image's allure. As months passed, the demand for copies of the portrait grew overwhelming. Families throughout New England requested prints for their own homes, believing that the young woman's peaceful presence would bring harmony to their households. Thorne found himself spending hours each day in his darkroom, carefully crafting prints from the original glass plate negative. Each copy required painstaking attention to detail to ensure that the luminous quality of the subject's skin and the intricate textures of her dress were perfectly reproduced. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been the first to learn the portrait's terrible secret, found herself drawn once again to Thorne's studio. She had tried to stay away, to put the disturbing knowledge behind her. But the rumors about the shadow figure had reignited her morbid fascination with the image that had once brought her such comfort. When she arrived at the studio on a cold December afternoon, she found Thorne in a state that shocked her. The man who had once been the picture of Victorian propriety was disheveled and wild-eyed, his clothing rumpled as if he had slept in it for days. The studio itself was in chaos, with photographic equipment scattered about, and dozens of enlarged sections of the portrait pinned to every available wall surface. Hartwell, Thorne said, without looking up from the magnifying glass he was holding over the original portrait, "You must see this. You must understand what we have been living with all these years." Despite her better judgment, Mrs. Hartwell approached the desk where the portrait hung. Under Thorne's powerful magnifying glass, she could indeed make out what appeared to be a figure in the shadows, indistinct but undeniably present. "What is it?" she whispered. "I believe," Thorne said, his voice barely steady, "that it is the one who came for Catherine. The one who was waiting when I took her photograph." The implication of his words sent chills through Mrs. Hartwell. If Thorne was right, if the shadow figure represented some kind of supernatural presence that had been drawn to Catherine's death, then every home that had displayed a copy of the portrait had been unknowingly harboring something far more sinister than a memorial photograph. As word of the shadow figure spread through Millbrook, the community's response moved beyond mere psychological trauma into something approaching mass hysteria. Families who had already removed their copies of the portrait from their walls began reporting that the strange phenomena in their homes had not ceased. Indeed, they seemed to be intensifying. The Spencer family, whose young daughter Emma had been one of the first children to report dreams about the sleeping lady, found their situation deteriorating rapidly. Emma's nightmares had evolved into something far more disturbing. She now claimed that the peaceful young woman from the portrait was no longer alone in her dreams. "There's a man with her now," Emma told her parents during one particularly harrowing episode. "He stands behind her and whispers things in her ear. She doesn't like him, but she can't make him go away. He tells her that he's been waiting a long time to have friends, and now he has lots of them because everyone has seen his picture." Similar reports began coming in from other families throughout the town. Children spoke of dreams in which Catherine Wynne appeared alongside a tall, dark figure who seemed to have some kind of hold over her. Adults reported waking in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that they were being watched, even though their rooms were empty and their doors locked. The Reverend Thomas Blackwood, whose son Timothy had begun sleepwalking after the portrait was removed from the rectory, decided to conduct his own investigation into what he termed the spiritual implications of the phenomenon. His theological training had not prepared him for the possibility that a photograph might serve as a conduit for supernatural forces, but the evidence of his own senses was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "If we accept," he wrote in a letter to his bishop, "that the photographic process can capture images invisible to the human eye, we must also consider the possibility that certain images might serve as windows between our world and realms we are not meant to perceive." The portrait of Miss Wynne appears to have documented not just her physical death, but the presence of something that was drawn to that death, something that may have used the widespread distribution of the image to extend its influence far beyond the confines of Mr. Thorne's studio. The Reverend's theory gained credence when he discovered historical precedents for similar phenomena. In his research through the Church's archives, he found references dating back centuries to cursed portraits and haunted images that had brought misfortune to those who possessed them. Most of these accounts had been dismissed as superstition. But in light of recent events, Blackwood began to reconsider their possible validity. Meanwhile, the psychological effects on the community continued to intensify. Dr. Morrison found himself treating an unprecedented number of patients for symptoms ranging from severe anxiety to what appeared to be genuine supernatural encounters. His medical training had not equipped him to deal with cases where the reported symptoms seemed to have no physical cause, yet produced very real psychological distress. "I am forced to consider," he wrote in his private notes, "that we may be dealing with a form of collective psychological contagion unlike anything documented in medical literature. The knowledge that they have been unknowingly exposed to something they perceive as evil or threatening has created a state of heightened suggestibility among the population. Whether the phenomena they report are objectively real or psychologically generated may be irrelevant. The effects on their mental health are identical either way." But Morrison's rational explanations were challenged when he began experiencing his own encounters with the inexplicable. On several occasions, while working late in his office, he reported seeing a tall figure reflected in the window behind his desk, a figure that was not present when he turned to look. The reflection always appeared when he was examining patient files related to the portrait case, as if something was reading over his shoulder. As December progressed, the situation in Millbrook reached a new level of crisis when Thorne made his most disturbing discovery yet. While examining the portrait under a new type of experimental lighting he had devised, he found that the shadow figure was not alone. Hidden even deeper in the photographic shadows were the outlines of additional figures, indistinct shapes that seemed to be gathered around Catherine's chair like a crowd of observers. "They are legion," Thorne wrote in what would be his final notebook entry. "I understand now that Catherine's death was not a private affair, but a public spectacle for entities that exist in the spaces between life and death. The photograph did not simply capture her peaceful transition from one state to another. It documented a gathering, a convocation of things that feed on the moment of death itself. And through the wide distribution of the image, I have invited all of them into the homes and hearts of innocent families." The revelation that the portrait might contain multiple supernatural presences triggered the final phase of Millbrook's descent into terror. Reports of paranormal activity escalated dramatically as families throughout the region began experiencing encounters not just with Catherine's peaceful spirit, but with the darker entities that seemed to have accompanied her into death. Children throughout New England began reporting identical nightmares in which they were surrounded by tall, dark figures who spoke in whispers about being invited and being welcomed. Adults found themselves waking to the sensation of being touched by cold hands, only to discover they were alone in their bedrooms. The scent of photographic chemicals, the sharp, acrid smell of the developing solutions Thorne used in his work, began appearing inexplicably in homes that had never housed a darkroom. Most disturbing of all were the reports of families finding additional figures appearing in their own photographs. Wedding portraits, family gatherings, children's birthday celebrations, images that had been perfectly normal when first developed, began showing shadowy presences lurking in the backgrounds. It was as if the entities that had been documented in Catherine's portrait were now appearing in other photographic records, spreading their influence through the very medium that had first captured them. The crisis reached its climax when Mrs. Hartwell made a terrible discovery in her own home. While examining her family's photograph collection, hoping to find evidence of the spreading supernatural contamination, she found that her daughter Sarah's engagement portrait, the one that was supposed to have been taken by Thorne but had been canceled due to his deteriorating condition, somehow existed anyway. The portrait showed Sarah in her wedding dress, posed in the same peaceful manner as Catherine Wynne had been, with the same serene expression and carefully folded hands. But Sarah had never sat for such a photograph. The engagement had been called off weeks ago when her fiancé's family learned of the horror surrounding Thorne's work. Yet, here was the image, perfectly executed in Thorne's distinctive style, showing her daughter as she had never appeared in life. And there, barely visible in the shadows behind Sarah's peaceful form, stood the same tall figure that had been discovered in Catherine's portrait. Closer now, its arms extended as if in welcome or embrace. The impossible photograph of Sarah Hartwell marked the point at which the supernatural crisis in Millbrook transcended mere psychological trauma and entered the realm of active supernatural threat. It was no longer a matter of disturbing memories or frightening dreams. The entities that had been documented in Catherine Wynn's post-mortem portrait were now actively creating new images, new invitations, new ways to extend their influence into the world of the living. As 1896 drew to its close, the people of Millbrook faced the horrifying realization that they were not simply dealing with the aftermath of a disturbing revelation about a beloved photograph. They were confronting something that had used that photograph as a doorway, something that was now actively working to expand its presence in their world. And at the center of it all, in his locked studio, surrounded by enlargements of shadows that grew darker with each passing day, Edmund Thorne sat staring at the portrait that had destroyed his life and his sanity. The peaceful image of Catherine Wynn gazed back at him with eyes that seemed to plead for release from whatever held her in its grasp. But Thorne was beginning to understand that release might not be possible. The shadow figures that crowded around Catherine in the photograph were not simply documentation of a past event. They were active presences, growing stronger with each person who viewed their image, feeding on the fear and fascination of those who learned their secret. The portrait that had once brought peace to so many was revealed to be something far more sinister. Not just a window into death, but a doorway that something ancient and hungry had been waiting decades to open wide enough to step through. The moment that would forever change how people saw beauty itself came on a crisp October afternoon in 1896. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at Edmund Thorne's studio for what she assumed would be a routine consultation about her daughter's engagement portrait. She had no idea that she was about to become the first person outside of Thorne himself to learn the horrifying truth behind the most beloved photograph in New England. As autumn light filtered through the studio's massive windows, Mrs. Mies Hartwell found herself once again drawn to the portrait that hung in its place of honor above Thorne's desk. For nearly 3 years, she had admired the mysterious young woman's peaceful expression, finding in it a source of comfort during her own times of trouble. Today, however, something seemed different about both the image and the man who had created it. Thorne appeared haggard, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled, his hands trembling as he attempted to pour tea from the delicate china service he kept for his most distinguished clients. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept well in weeks, and his conversation seemed distracted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences during which his gaze would drift inevitably to the portrait. "Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Hartwell said finally, unable to ignore his obvious distress, "you seem quite unwell. Perhaps we should postpone our discussion about Sarah's engagement portrait until you're feeling better." "No," Thorne replied with startling intensity, his cup rattling against its saucer as he set it down. "No, Mrs. Hartwell, I cannot postpone anything any longer. I can no longer bear the weight of what I know while others remain in ignorance." Mrs. Hartwell felt a chill of unease at his words. But before she could respond, Thorne rose from his chair and moved to stand directly beneath the portrait that had become his torment. "You have often asked me about this image," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the young woman who appears so perfectly at peace. You have called her an angel, a vision of divine serenity. Others have said the same. For 3 years I have listened to such praise while carrying a secret that grows heavier with each passing day." "Mr. Thorne, you're frightening me," Mrs. Hartwell said, but even as she spoke, she found her eyes drawn once again to the peaceful face in the portrait. Something about Thorne's manner was making her see the image differently, though she could not yet identify what had changed. "The young woman in this portrait is named Catherine Wynn," Thorne said, his voice growing stronger as he began to unburden himself of his terrible knowledge. "She was 22 years old when this photograph was taken on October 15th, 1893. She was indeed beautiful as she appears in the image, and she was indeed at peace." Mrs. Hartwell waited for him to continue, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would fundamentally alter her understanding of the portrait she had so long admired. Catherine Wynne had been dead for 6 hours when I took that photograph. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Mrs. Hartwell felt the room spin around her as the implications began to sink in. The peaceful expression she had found so comforting, the serene pose that had brought tranquility to so many homes, the angelic beauty that had captured the hearts of an entire region, all of it was death, carefully arranged and artfully disguised. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as she spoke, she was looking at the portrait with new eyes. The perfect stillness that had once suggested inner peace now took on a different meaning. The downcast eyes that had seemed to indicate modest contemplation could now be seen as the natural droop of lifeless lids. The folded hands that had appeared to be a gesture of prayer were revealed as the classic positioning used to hide the discoloration that follows death. Thorne moved to his desk and withdrew a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with the meticulous records he kept of every photographic session. Catherine died of consumption on the morning of October 15, 1893, he read from his careful notes. Her family brought her body to my studio that same afternoon, before the rigor mortis could set in completely. They wanted one final photograph, a memorial to remember her as she had been in life. Beautiful, peaceful, untouched by the ravages of her final illness. Mrs. Hartwell felt nausea rising in her throat as Thorne continued his recitation of the technical details that had created the illusion of life and death. The session required nearly 4 hours of careful preparation. I used a specialized brace to support her neck and maintain the position of her head. Her eyes were held in their apparently natural position with tiny clips, hidden by the angle of the photograph and the careful arrangement of her hair. The peaceful expression you have so admired was created by manually positioning the facial muscles before they stiffened permanently. Each detail that had made the portrait so beautiful now seemed grotesque to Mrs. Hartwell. The luminous quality of the subject's skin that had seemed to glow with inner light was revealed as the careful application of cosmetics designed to restore the appearance of life to dead flesh. The perfect composure that had suggested spiritual enlightenment was nothing more than the absolute stillness of a corpse. "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Hartwell managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "Because I cannot bear the deception any longer," Thorne replied, his own voice heavy with anguish. "For 3 years, I have watched people find comfort and peace in that image, knowing that they are admiring my skill at disguising death itself. Every compliment feels like a mockery of Catherine's memory and a reminder of the terrible lie I have perpetuated." The revelation that began in Thorne's studio that October afternoon did not remain contained, despite his pleas for discretion. Mrs. Hartwell, shaken to her very core by what she had learned, found herself unable to keep the terrible secret. Within days, the truth about the portrait that had brought so much comfort to so many families began to spread through Millbrook's interconnected social circles like a plague. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Families who had hung copies of the portrait in their homes, who had found peace in the young woman's serene expression, who had used her image as a source of comfort during difficult times, suddenly found themselves confronted with the knowledge that they had been unknowingly celebrating death. Mrs. Adelaide Spencer, who had placed a copy of the portrait in her 5-year-old daughter's nursery, removed it immediately upon learning the truth. But the damage had already been done. Little Emma Spencer, who had grown accustomed to the gentle presence of the peaceful lady watching over her sleep, began having nightmares the very night the portrait was removed. "Mama," the child cried out during one particularly disturbing episode, "the sleeping lady is sad now. She says no one loves her anymore because they know she's cold. She wants to know why everyone is afraid of her when she was only trying to be beautiful." Dr. James Morrison, the rational man of science who had displayed the portrait in his medical office, reported experiencing profound psychological distress upon learning its true nature. "It is remarkable," he wrote in a letter to a colleague, "how completely knowledge can transform perception. The same arrangement of light and shadow that once conveyed life and peace now screams death at me. I find myself unable to look at the image without feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and revulsion. The phenomenon was not limited to adults. Throughout Millbrook, children who had grown up under the gentle gaze of Catherine Wynn's portrait began reporting disturbing dreams. They spoke of a sad young woman who visited them in their sleep, asking why everyone had stopped loving her, why her picture had been taken away, why people now looked upon her with fear instead of admiration. These childhood encounters with the portrait subject took on an increasingly disturbing pattern. The children described Catherine as appearing in their dreams exactly as she looked in the photograph, wearing the same white dress, maintaining the same peaceful expression. But they consistently reported that she was cold to the touch and that her presence filled them with an inexplicable sense of sorrow. 8-year-old Timothy Blackwood, son of the rector, who had hung the portrait in St. Mary's Rectory, began sleepwalking for the first time in his life. His parents would find him standing in the hallway outside his father's study, staring at the spot where the portrait had hung before its hasty removal. "She's still there," Timothy would say, when awakened from these episodes. "She doesn't understand why her picture was taken down. She wants to know what she did wrong." The collective psychological trauma that gripped Millbrook in the wake of the revelation created an atmosphere of unease that seemed to permeate every aspect of daily life. Conversations that had once been lighthearted now carried undertones of anxiety. Social gatherings became subdued affairs as families struggled to process the knowledge that they had been finding comfort in an image of death. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Herald, attempted to address the crisis with a carefully worded editorial titled, "On the Nature of Artistic Truth." The editor, Mr. Samuel Worthington, wrote, "Recent revelations concerning a certain photographic portrait that has long been cherished by our community have caused considerable distress among our citizens. While we understand the shock that such knowledge must bring, we encourage our readers to remember that art has always involved elements of illusion and transformation. The skill required to create beauty from tragedy should perhaps be admired rather than condemned." But Worthington's attempts at rationalization fell on deaf ears. The community's relationship with beauty itself had been fundamentally altered. People began to question other works of art in their homes and public spaces, wondering what secrets might lurk behind apparently innocent images. The portrait had taught them that appearances could be not merely deceptive, but actively horrifying in their deception. Meanwhile, Thorne himself was experiencing the most severe psychological effects of his revelation. The guilt that had prompted his confession had not been relieved by sharing his secret. Instead, it had been compounded by witnessing the devastation his honesty had caused. He found himself spending hours each day staring at the original portrait, as if searching for some sign of forgiveness from Catherine's peaceful face. His behavior became increasingly erratic. Clients arrived for appointments to find the studio locked, with Thorne nowhere to be found. When he was present, his work showed a marked decline in quality as his hands trembled too severely to operate his equipment with his former precision. The man who had once been New England's most celebrated portrait photographer seemed to be disintegrating before the eyes of those who knew him. His notebook entries from this period reveal a mind under tremendous strain. November 3, 1896, Mrs. Byam Henderson came to retrieve her family portrait today. When she saw Catherine's portrait still hanging above my desk, she became hysterical. She screamed that I was a monster, that I had polluted her home with the presence of death. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps I am indeed a monster. November 8, 1896. I tried to take down Catherine's portrait today, but found I could not bring myself to do so. It is as if removing it would be a final betrayal of her memory. She deserves to be remembered, even if that memory now brings only horror to those who see her. November 12, 1896. The portrait looks different today. The shadows seem deeper, and I swear I can see movement in the darkness behind Catherine's figure. I know this is impossible. Photographs are static objects, but I cannot shake the feeling that something in the image is watching me. The psychological deterioration of the portrait's creator became a source of additional distress for the community. People who had once sought out Thorne's artistic services now crossed the street to avoid encountering him during his increasingly rare ventures outside his studio. The man who had brought so much beauty into their lives had become a living reminder of the terrible knowledge that now haunted them all. As November progressed, reports began to surface of strange occurrences in homes where copies of the portrait had once hung. Even after the images had been removed and destroyed, families continued to experience unsettling phenomena. Children reported seeing the peaceful young woman standing in corners of their rooms, always maintaining the same serene expression, always asking in whispers why she was no longer loved. The Hartwell family, whose matriarch had been the first to learn the portrait's secret, found themselves at the center of increasingly disturbing events. Elizabeth Hartwell began experiencing vivid dreams in which she found herself lying motionless while invisible hands arranged her body and positioned her face in preparation for a photograph she would never see. She would wake from these dreams with the absolute certainty that she had been dead during the experience, aware of her surroundings, but unable to move or speak. Her daughter Sarah, the young woman whose engagement portrait was to have been the reason for that fateful October consultation, began refusing to allow any photographs to be taken of her. "How can we be certain," she asked her mother, "that any portrait is what it appears to be? How do we know that the photographers are telling us the truth about their subjects?" The fear and paranoia that gripped Millbrook extended beyond mere concern about photographic portraits. The community's faith in the reliability of visual evidence had been fundamentally shaken. If something as beautiful and peaceful as Catherine Wynn's portrait could conceal such horror, what other deceptions might be hiding in plain sight? Local businesses began to suffer as people avoided public spaces where portraits or paintings might be displayed. The town's small art gallery was forced to close temporarily when visitors began experiencing panic attacks while viewing the collection. Even family photographs became suspect, with some residents covering or removing images that had once brought them joy. Dr. Morrison, in his attempts to understand the psychological phenomenon that had overtaken his community, began conducting informal interviews with affected families. His notes from this period provide valuable insight into the collective trauma that a single revelation could cause. What we are witnessing is the complete breakdown of the relationship between appearance and reality that governs our daily existence. Mrs. Hartwell reports that she can no longer look at her own reflection without wondering if she is truly alive or merely an elaborate arrangement designed to create the illusion of life. Young Timothy Blackwood has begun testing his own pulse obsessively, as if to reassure himself of his continued existence. The portrait has taught us that death can be disguised so completely that it appears as the highest form of beauty, and this knowledge has poisoned our ability to trust our own perceptions. As the autumn of 1896 drew toward its close, the situation in Millbrook had reached a crisis point. The revelation of a single photograph's true nature had triggered a community-wide existential crisis that showed no signs of abating. People who had once found comfort in beauty now lived in constant fear of deception. The portrait that had brought peace to so many had become the source of their deepest anxieties. And at the center of it all sat Edmund Thorne in his studio, staring at the image that had made him famous and was now destroying him. The terrible truth he had finally shared had not brought him the relief he had expected. Instead, it had opened a door to something far more disturbing than simple deception. As he gazed upon Catherine Wynn's peaceful face, Thorne was beginning to suspect that the horror of what he had created went beyond merely photographing death. Something else was present in that portrait, something that his conscious mind had not recognized when he captured the image 3 years ago. And as the days grew shorter and the shadows in his studio grew longer, that something was beginning to make itself known in ways that defied both reason and sanity. The revelation of the portrait's true nature had been only the beginning. What was to come would make the community's current trauma seem like a pleasant dream compared to the nightmare that was slowly awakening in the spaces between life and death, hidden in the shadows of the most peaceful photograph ever taken. 3 weeks had passed since Edmund Thorne's devastating revelation about Catherine Wynn's portrait, and the town of Millbrook had settled into an uneasy state that resembled peace, but felt more like the tense quiet before a thunderstorm. The initial shock of learning that their beloved image was actually a memorial to the dead had given way to a deeper, more pervasive anxiety that seemed to infect every aspect of daily life. But for Thorne himself, the nightmare was only beginning. The terrible truth he had shared with Mrs. Hartwell had not brought him the relief he had desperately sought. Instead, it had somehow opened a door in his mind, allowing him to see things in the portrait that he had never noticed before, or perhaps had seen, but his conscious mind had refused to acknowledge. It was on a gray November morning, as pale winter light filtered through the frost-covered windows of his studio, that Thorne made the discovery that would complete his descent into madness. He had been examining the original glass plate negative with a magnifying glass, something he had done countless times over the past 3 years, when his attention was caught by an anomaly in the shadows behind Catherine's left shoulder. At first, he dismissed it as a flaw in the glass, or perhaps a speck of dust that had settled on the plate during the development process. But as he adjusted the angle of his examination and increased the magnification, the anomaly resolved into something far more disturbing. There, barely visible in the deep shadows of the studio background, was the unmistakable outline of another figure. Thorne's hands began to tremble as he studied the shadowy presence more closely. The shape was indistinct, more suggestion than clear image, but it definitely appeared to be human. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like dark clothing. Most unsettling of all, the figure seemed to be leaning forward slightly, as if observing the photographic session with keen interest. The discovery filled Thorne with a terror that went beyond rational explanation. He had been meticulous in his documentation of every post-mortem session, partly for professional records and partly because the delicate work required such careful attention to detail. He knew with absolute certainty that no living person had been present in his studio during Catherine's photograph. He had worked alone with her body, as was his custom with such sensitive commissions. The studio had been locked, the curtains drawn, and he had worked by the light of his gas lamps. Yet there, captured in the same photographic emulsion that had recorded Catherine's carefully arranged corpse, was the clear impression of someone watching. Desperate to understand what he was seeing, Thorne obtained a more powerful magnifying apparatus from the town's jeweler, Mr. Abraham Cohen. Under this increased magnification, the shadowy figure became slightly more defined. It appeared to be wearing a long coat or jacket, and what might have been a hat obscured the features of its face. But most disturbing of all was the posture of the figure. It was definitely leaning forward, arms slightly extended, as if reaching toward the carefully posed body of Catherine Wynn. Thorne's notebook entries from this period reveal a mind grappling with discoveries that challenged everything he understood about reality. November 18, 1896. The figure is definitely present in the original negative. I have examined every inch of the glass plate under maximum magnification. This is not a flaw in the emulsion, not a trick of light or shadow. Something was in my studio during Catherine's session, something I could not see with my naked eye, but which the camera captured with perfect clarity. November 21st, 1896. I have been researching the properties of photographic emulsions, hoping to find some scientific explanation for what I am seeing. The silver compounds used in the wet collodion process are sensitive to certain spectra of light that the human eye cannot perceive. Is it possible that this figure exists in some wavelength of reality that photography can capture, but human vision cannot detect? November 24th, 1896. The figure appears to be moving. I know this is impossible. Photographs are static objects. But I swear, the shadow has changed position since I first noticed it. Yesterday, it seemed to be standing upright behind Catherine. Today it appears to be leaning further forward, as if trying to get closer to her. As Thorne's obsession with the shadow figure intensified, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He began spending entire nights in his studio, studying the portrait under various lighting conditions, hoping to reveal more details about the mysterious presence. He experimented with different magnifying devices, adjusted the gas lamps to cast light from different angles, and even attempted to create photographic enlargements of specific sections of the image. His efforts were rewarded with increasingly disturbing discoveries. Under certain lighting conditions, what appeared to be the face of the shadowy figure became dimly visible. The features were indistinct, but they seemed to belong to a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes and a gaunt expression. Most unsettling of all, the figure's gaze appeared to be fixed not on Catherine's peaceful face, but directly at the camera, as if it were aware that it was being photographed. Dr. James Morrison, concerned about his friend's deteriorating mental state, visited Thorne's studio several times during this period. His notes provide the only reliable account of the photographer's final weeks. Thorne has aged years in a matter of days. His hands shake constantly, and he speaks only of what he calls the watcher in the shadows. He insists there is another presence captured in Catherine's portrait, though I must confess that when he showed me the area he was examining, I could see nothing but the normal variations in light and shadow that one would expect in any photograph. I fear that his guilt over the post-mortem deception has triggered a complete psychological breakdown. But Morrison's rational assessment was challenged when Thorne shared his most recent discovery. Using a technique he had learned from a colleague in Boston, Thorne had created a photographic negative of the portrait, essentially reversing the light and dark areas of the original image. In this negative version, the shadowy figure became dramatically more visible. A tall, thin man in dark clothing, standing directly behind Catherine's chair, with his arms extended toward her peaceful form. Even if we accept that this is some kind of optical illusion or photographic artifact, Morrison wrote, the consistency and detail of the figure are deeply unsettling. Thorne has shown me dozens of enlargements and variations of the image, and in each one, the figure appears in the same position with the same threatening posture. If this is madness, it is madness with a remarkable consistency to its delusions. The discovery of the shadow figure marked the beginning of a new phase in Millbrook's collective trauma. Word of Thorne's findings spread quickly through the community, adding another layer of horror to the already disturbing revelation about the portrait's true nature. It was no longer simply a matter of a photograph of the dead being passed off as a portrait of the living. Now, there was the possibility that something else, something that should not have been present at all, had been captured in the image. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. The winter of 1897 brought to Millbrook a darkness that seemed to emanate from within the town itself, rather than from the shortened days and overcast skies. And the discovery of Sarah Hartwell's impossible engagement portrait had shattered the last vestiges of rational explanation for the supernatural crisis that gripped the community. No longer could the strange phenomena be dismissed as psychological reactions to disturbing knowledge. Something actively malevolent was at work, using photography itself as a means to cross the boundaries between worlds. Edmund Thorne had not been seen in public for over a week when Mrs. Hartwell made the decision that would lead to the final, horrifying revelation about Catherine Wynn's portrait. Driven by a mother's desperation to understand the threat facing her daughter, she convinced Dr. Morrison to accompany her to Thorne's studio for what they both suspected might be their last encounter with the photographer. They found the studio's front door unlocked, creaking open at the slightest touch to reveal a scene of almost complete chaos. Photographic equipment lay scattered across the floor, glass plates shattered into glittering fragments that crunched beneath their feet. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographic prints and enlargements, all showing different sections of Catherine's portrait, all revealing new and increasingly disturbing details about the shadow figures that surrounded her peaceful form. But it was the smell that struck them first. The sharp, overwhelming scent of photographic chemicals mixed with something else, something organic and corrupt that suggested decay and death. The odor grew stronger as they climbed the stairs to the main studio, where they found Edmund Thorne. The photographer sat slumped in his chair behind the mahogany desk, his lifeless eyes staring at the portrait that still hung in its position of honor above his workspace. The coroner would later determine that he had died of heart failure, But the expression frozen on his features suggested that his final moments had been filled with absolute terror. Scattered around Thorne's body were dozens of photographic plates and prints, the culmination of his obsessive investigation into the shadows that had haunted his masterpiece. But it was what Mrs. Hartwell and Dr. Morrison discovered among these final works that revealed the true scope of the horror that had been unleashed upon their community. Thorne had somehow managed to create what appeared to be a complete photographic record of the supernatural entities that existed within Catherine's portrait. Using techniques that neither of his discoverers could understand, he had isolated and enlarged each shadow figure until their details became clearly visible. The results were images of beings that belonged to no earthly realm, tall, gaunt figures with faces that seemed to shift and blur even in the static medium of photography, their eyes reflecting a hunger that transcended physical needs. But most disturbing of all was Thorne's final photograph, still wet with developing chemicals, lying on the desk beside his corpse. It showed Catherine Wynne exactly as she appeared in the original portrait, but her peaceful expression had changed. Her eyes, which had been gently downcast in serene contemplation, were now wide open and staring directly at the viewer with an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Morrison, despite his scientific training and rational worldview, found himself unable to explain away what he was seeing. "It is as if," he wrote in his subsequent report to the authorities, "the original subject of the portrait has somehow become aware of her situation and is attempting to communicate her distress to the living world." The technical impossibility of such a thing does not diminish the visual evidence before our eyes. As Mrs. Hartwell and Dr. Morrison examined Thorne's final works, they made additional discoveries that revealed the true scope of the supernatural infestation that had taken hold in Millbrook. Hidden among the photographer's papers were dozens of letters from residents throughout New England, all reporting similar phenomena in their homes. The influence of the shadow figures had spread far beyond the borders of their small town, following the distributed copies of Catherine's portrait into hundreds of households across the region. The letters painted a picture of communities in crisis, families driven from their homes by supernatural manifestations that seemed to center around photographic images. Children throughout the Northeast were reporting encounters with the peaceful lady and her dark companions. Adults were discovering impossible photographs appearing in their homes. Images of deceased relatives posed in the same manner as Catherine, always accompanied by the same shadowy presences lurking in the backgrounds. Most alarming of all were the reports of people disappearing entirely, leaving behind only mysteriously perfect portraits that showed them in the same peaceful pose that had made Catherine's image so beloved. These disappearances followed a pattern that suggested something was actively hunting through the network of supernatural influence that Thorne's work had created. Among Thorne's papers, Mrs. Hartwell found a letter addressed to her personally, written in the photographer's increasingly erratic handwriting. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell, if you are reading this, then I have likely succumbed to the forces I have unknowingly unleashed. I must tell you what I have discovered about the true nature of Catherine Wynne and the circumstances of her death, for I believe your daughter may be in immediate danger. Catherine Wynne never existed as a living person. I have searched every record, every registry, every possible source of documentation, and I can find no evidence that she was ever born or lived in this world. Yet her body was brought to my studio on October 15, 1893, by individuals whose faces I can no longer clearly remember and whose names I now suspect were false. I believe that Catherine was something else entirely, perhaps a vessel or an anchor point created by entities that exist in the spaces between life and death. The post-mortem portrait was not a memorial to a deceased person, but a ritual, a ceremony that used the photographic process to open a permanent doorway between worlds. The shadow figures that crowd around Catherine in the image are not merely observers of death. They are harvesters, entities that feed on the life force of the living by gradually drawing them across the boundary into death. The widespread distribution of the portrait has given them access to every home where a copy was displayed, and they have been slowly claiming victims ever since. Your daughter's impossible engagement portrait is not a random occurrence. It is an invitation, a sign that she has been selected as the next to join Catherine in their eternal peaceful pose. You must act quickly if you wish to save her. The letter continued with increasingly frantic instructions for what Thorne believed might be the only way to break the supernatural connection that had been established. He urged Mrs. Hartwell to gather all remaining copies of Catherine's portrait and destroy them simultaneously, while performing what amounted to an exorcism ritual in his studio where the original negative was housed. Mrs. Hartwell and Dr. Huang Morrison realized they were facing a choice between accepting an explanation that defied all rational understanding or watching helplessly as more members of their community disappeared into whatever realm the shadow figures inhabited. The evidence of their own eyes, combined with the mounting reports from across New England, left them little choice but to attempt Thorne's desperate solution. Over the following days, they worked frantically to locate every surviving copy of Catherine's portrait. The task proved more difficult than expected, as many families had hidden their copies rather than destroying them, unable to completely sever their connection to an image that had once brought them so much comfort. Others reported that their copies had mysteriously vanished from wherever they had been stored, as if the portraits themselves were actively evading destruction. As they searched, the supernatural manifestations in Millbrook continued to escalate. More impossible photographs appeared in homes throughout the town, images of living residents posed in death-like serenity, always accompanied by the shadow figures that seemed to grow more substantial with each new manifestation. Several families reported that their children had begun speaking in voices that were not their own, carrying on conversations with invisible companions who promised them eternal peace and perfect rest. The crisis reached its peak on February 14, 1897, when Sarah Hartwell disappeared from her locked bedroom, leaving behind only a newly created portrait that showed her in the same peaceful pose as Catherine Wynne. This image was different from all the others, however, in that it showed Sarah not as she had appeared in life, but as she would look after death, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes closed in the final sleep, her expression one of absolute tranquility. The photograph was technically perfect, executed in Thorne's distinctive style despite the fact that the photographer had been dead for weeks. But most disturbing of all was what appeared in the shadows behind Sarah's peaceful form. The tall figures were no longer lurking in the background. They stood clearly visible on either side of her chair, their gaunt faces showing expressions of satisfaction, as if they had finally achieved some long-sought goal. Mrs. Hartwell's grief and terror drove her to take drastic action. Gathering the few allies who still believed in the supernatural explanation for their community's crisis, she organized what amounted to a desperate assault on Thorne's studio. Armed with matches, lamp oil, and a determination born of maternal desperation, the group prepared to destroy not just the remaining photographs, but the studio itself. As they entered the building where it all began, they found that the supernatural presence had grown almost overwhelming. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, filled with whispers in languages that human ears were not meant to hear. The walls were covered with new photographs that had appeared since Thorne's death, hundreds of portraits showing residents of Millbrook and beyond, all posed in the same peaceful manner, all accompanied by the same shadow figures that seemed to feed on the process of dying. At the center of it all, Catherine Wynne's original portrait hung above Thorne's desk, but it had changed dramatically since their last visit. The peaceful young woman was no longer alone in the frame. Sarah Hartwell stood beside her now, both figures maintaining the same serene expressions, while the shadow figures that surrounded them appeared more solid and substantial than ever before. But it was what happened next that revealed the true horror of what they were confronting. As Mrs. Hartwell approached her daughter's impossible portrait with a match in her hand, both figures in the image seemed to become aware of her presence. Their peaceful expressions shifted to ones of desperate pleading, and Mrs. Hartwell could swear she heard her daughter's voice calling to her from within the photograph itself. "Mama, don't leave me here with them," the voice whispered, barely audible, but unmistakably Sarah's. They promised it would be peaceful, but it's not. We can see everything, but we can't move, can't speak except in whispers. They feed on our stillness, our perfect peace. Please don't let them add anyone else to their collection. The revelation that the shadow figures were not simply harvesting the living, but trapping them in some form of conscious death, drove Mrs. Hartwell to a frenzy of destructive action. She and her companions spread lamp oil throughout the studio and set it ablaze, watching as decades of photographic work went up in flames. As the fire consumed Thorne's life work, something extraordinary happened. The impossible photographs began to change as they burned. The peaceful expressions of the subjects shifted to looks of relief and gratitude, as if they were finally being released from whatever had held them captive. The shadow figures, meanwhile, seemed to writhe and struggle as the flames destroyed their anchors in the physical world. But the most remarkable transformation was in Catherine Wynn's original portrait. As the fire reached the glass plate negative, the image seemed to come alive. Catherine's peaceful expression changed to one of desperate urgency as she appeared to be struggling against invisible bonds. The shadow figures around her became increasingly agitated, their forms flickering between solid and ethereal as their connection to the physical world weakened. In the final moments before the negative shattered in the heat, Mrs. Hartwell saw her daughter's image fade from the portrait, as if Sarah were being released from whatever supernatural prison had held her. Catherine's figure lingered a moment longer, and in that instant, her expression changed one last time to one of profound gratitude, before she too vanished as the glass plate cracked and dissolved in the flames. The destruction of Thorne's studio marked the end of the supernatural crisis that had gripped New England for over 3 years. Reports of paranormal activity throughout the region ceased almost immediately, as if a network of supernatural influence had been severed at its source. Children stopped having nightmares about peaceful ladies and shadow figures. Adults no longer found impossible photographs appearing in their homes. The collective psychological trauma that had afflicted entire communities began to heal. Sarah Hartwell was found 3 days later, alive but with no memory of where she had been or what had happened to her during the time she was missing. She retained only vague impressions of standing very still for a very long time while cold hands arranged her pose and whispered promises of eternal peace. Medical examination revealed no physical harm, but she never again allowed herself to be photographed, claiming that cameras made her feel as though she was falling back into the stillness. Dr. Morrison spent years documenting the case and its aftermath, eventually publishing a carefully worded academic paper that discussed the psychological effects of community-wide exposure to disturbing imagery. He never publicly revealed the full supernatural dimension of what they had experienced, knowing that such claims would destroy his medical reputation. However, his private notes, discovered after his death, provide the most complete record of what he came to believe was genuine supernatural intervention in the natural world. The site of Thorne's studio remained empty for decades, with locals reporting an unwillingness to approach the burned ruins. Eventually, the lot was cleared and a small park was built in its place. But even today, visitors sometimes report feeling watched when they walk through the area, particularly during the late autumn months when the light takes on the same quality that once filtered through Thorne's studio windows. The case of Catherine Wynn's portrait became a cautionary tale that spread throughout New England and beyond, though the supernatural elements were gradually stripped away as the story passed from person to person. What remained was a vague warning about the dangers of post-mortem photography and the psychological effects of deceptive imagery. The full truth was too disturbing for most people to accept or remember. Modern researchers who have studied the surviving documentation continue to debate the exact nature of what occurred in Millbrook during those terrifying months. Skeptics attribute the entire affair to mass hysteria triggered by the revelation about the portrait's true nature. They point out that no physical evidence of the supernatural phenomena survives, and that eyewitness accounts from traumatic events are notoriously unreliable. But believers in the paranormal find in the case compelling evidence that certain types of imagery can serve as conduits for forces beyond human understanding. They note the consistency of the reported phenomena across wide geographic areas and the identical nature of encounters experienced by people who had no contact with each other. The fact that the crisis ended abruptly with the destruction of the original photographs suggests, they argue, that something genuine and dangerous had been anchored to those images. Perhaps most significantly, the case established patterns that paranormal researchers continue to study today. The connection between photography and supernatural phenomena, the role of death imagery in creating doorways between worlds, and the way that mass distribution of such images can spread supernatural influence across vast areas, all became subjects of ongoing investigation. The few surviving written accounts of the case, preserved in private collections and historical archives, continue to fascinate researchers and horror enthusiasts. They serve as a reminder that the Victorian era's fascination with capturing and preserving images of the dead may have had consequences that extended far beyond the psychological comfort such photographs were meant to provide. Today, more than a century after Catherine Wynn's portrait first brought peace to the parlors of New England, the story serves as a chilling reminder that beauty and horror are often separated by the thinnest of veils. The image that looked so peaceful until the photographer told the truth revealed that sometimes the most comforting illusions conceal the most terrifying realities. The portrait is gone now, destroyed in the flames that consumed Edmund Thorne's studio and, hopefully, severed the connections it had created between the world of the living and the realm of the shadow figures that fed on perfect, eternal stillness. But the memory of that peaceful face and the terrible knowledge of what it truly represented continues to haunt those who delve too deeply into the mysteries of death, photography, and the spaces between worlds where hungry things wait for invitations to cross over into our reality. In the end, the case of Catherine Wynn's portrait stands as a testament to the power of images to shape our perception of reality and the danger of trusting too completely in appearances, no matter how beautiful or comforting they might seem. For in a world where cameras can capture more than the human eye can see, we must always be prepared for the possibility that what we think we are viewing might be something altogether different and infinitely more dangerous than what it appears to be. The peaceful portrait that brought comfort to so many revealed itself to be a window into horror, and its destruction came only at the cost of lives, sanity, and the community's faith in the reliability of their own perceptions. It remains a cautionary tale about the price of beauty built on deception and the terrible consequences that can follow when we invite unknown forces into our homes through the seemingly innocent medium of photography. The story ends with fire and destruction, with the shattering of glass and the burning of lies. But somewhere in the shadows, between exposure and development, between life and death, between what we see and what sees us, the lesson of Catherine Wynn's portrait continues to whisper its warning to anyone foolish enough to believe that a photograph can capture only what was truly there when the shutter clicked and the light fell upon the waiting film. The End, one of Millbrook's most prominent socialites, hung her copy in the main drawing room of her mansion on Beacon Hill. It transforms the entire room, she told her friends at weekly tea gatherings. There's something about her presence that makes every conversation more meaningful, every gathering more harmonious. I swear the very atmosphere changes when you look upon her face. Young mothers began requesting copies for their children's nurseries, convinced that the peaceful image would help their little ones sleep more soundly. The Reverend Thomas Blackwood acquired a print for the rectory of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, where it hung beside his desk as he prepared his sermons. Even the town's physicians began displaying copies in their waiting rooms, finding that patients seemed calmer and more at ease in the presence of the mysterious young woman's serene gaze. The portrait's influence extended beyond mere decoration. People reported that contemplating the image during times of stress or grief brought them genuine comfort. Widows found solace in the young woman's peaceful expression during their darkest hours. Business owners claimed that having the portrait in their offices helped them make more thoughtful decisions. Students preparing for examinations swore that studying in the presence of the image improved their concentration and reduced their anxiety. As 1894 turned into 1895, the portrait had become something approaching a cultural phenomenon. Art critics from Boston and New York traveled to Millbrook specifically to study Thorne's masterpiece. Professor Augustus Whitman, from Harvard's Department of Fine Arts, wrote extensively about what he called the transcendent quality of spiritual portraiture, using Thorne's work as the prime example of photography's potential to capture not just physical reality, but the essence of the human soul. This single image, Professor Whitman declared in his influential essay published in the Atlantic Monthly, represents the pinnacle of photographic artistry. The subject's expression suggests a level of inner peace that philosophers and theologians have spent centuries trying to define. In capturing this moment of perfect serenity, Mr. Thorne has given us a glimpse of what the human spirit might achieve if freed from the troubles and anxieties of mortal existence. The portrait's fame spread far beyond New England's borders. Photographic societies in major cities requested copies for their exhibitions. European collectors began making inquiries about acquiring prints. Thorne found himself fielding correspondence from as far away as California and even London, all seeking copies of what had become known throughout the artistic community as the Angel of Millbrook. But as the portrait's reputation grew, so too did the pressure on Thorne to reveal more about its origins. Journalists began making pilgrimages to his studio, hoping to uncover the story behind the image that had captured the imagination of an entire region. Art collectors offered substantial sums, not just for prints, but for information about the subject. Who was this mysterious young woman? What had brought her to Thorne's studio? What was the source of the profound peace that seemed to radiate from her very being? Thorne's responses to these inquiries became increasingly evasive. Where once he had simply deflected questions with vague references to privacy, he now seemed genuinely distressed when pressed for details. Visitors noticed that he would often glance nervously at the portrait while discussing it, as if seeing something in the image that others could not perceive. His hands would tremble slightly when handling the original glass plate negative, and he began to insist on personally overseeing every aspect of the printing process, allowing no assistants to touch the precious original. Mrs. Hartwell, who had become one of the portrait's most devoted admirers, began to notice subtle changes in Thorne's behavior during her regular visits to his studio. The photographer, who had once taken evident pride in his masterpiece, now seemed almost haunted by it. He would stare at the image for long periods, his face etched with an expression that seemed part fascination, part dread. "Sometimes I wonder," he confided to Mrs. Hartwell during one particularly unsettling visit, "whether we truly understand the power of images to affect our lives. This portrait has brought so much joy to so many people, but I sometimes feel as though I've unleashed something into the world that I don't fully comprehend." The comment struck Mrs. Hartwell as odd, but she attributed it to the artistic temperament that often afflicted creative individuals. Surely Thorne was simply experiencing the mixed emotions that came with creating something so universally beloved. It was natural, she reasoned, for an artist to feel both pride and anxiety when his work achieved such widespread acclaim. As 1895 progressed into 1896, the portrait continued to bring comfort and peace to the hundreds of families who had acquired copies. Children grew up under the gentle gaze of the mysterious young woman. Couples began their marriages with her blessing hanging in their homes. The elderly found solace in her presence during their final days. The image had become woven into the fabric of New England society, a constant source of beauty and tranquility in an often harsh and unforgiving world. But beneath this surface of universal admiration, something was beginning to change in Edmund Thorne. Those who knew him well noticed that he had grown increasingly reclusive, spending more and more time alone in his studio with the original portrait. His other work began to suffer as he became obsessed with studying every detail of his masterpiece, examining it under magnifying glasses with an intensity that bordered on mania. His notebook entries from this period, discovered after his death, reveal a mind beginning to fracture under some unspoken burden, March 15th, 1896. Examine the original negative again today. There are details in the shadows that I never noticed before. How is it possible that an image I created contains elements I do not remember capturing? March 22nd, 1896. Mrs. Henderson visited today to commission a portrait of her deceased husband. When she saw the portrait, she wept uncontrollably. She said it reminded her of how peaceful he looked in his coffin. Why would she say such a thing? There is nothing of death in that beautiful face. March 30th, 1896. I dreamed of her again last night. In the dream, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. They were not the eyes of the living. I woke screaming. Perhaps I should stop taking commissions for a while. The growing tension between the portrait's public acclaim and Thorne's private torment was approaching a breaking point. The image that had brought peace to so many was becoming a source of increasing anguish for its creator. And as autumn approached, the weight of whatever secret Thorne carried was becoming too great to bear alone. The stage was set for a revelation that would transform the most beloved photograph in New England into something far more sinister. The portrait that had brought comfort to hundreds was about to reveal a truth so disturbing that those who learned it would never again be able to look upon beauty without wondering what horrors it might conceal. As October 1896 dawned crisp and clear, Edmund Thorne made a decision that would shatter the peaceful world he had created with a single image. The time had come to tell the truth about the young woman whose serene face had captured so many hearts. But he could never have anticipated that his honesty would unleash consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. The portrait that looked so peaceful was about to reveal its terrible secret, and nothing in Millbrook would ever be the same again.